Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Quarantine-ish Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am so happy to be back with you tonight for our first program of 2021. It's a new year, it's a new era, feeling good. If you are new to JWA and to our Quarantine Book Talks, thank you for joining us. And if you've been with us for months, welcome back. We are really excited to be starting up again with a new series. I'm really excited about the coming series, with thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities for supporting our online programming and to jewishLIVE for their partnership. For those of you who are new to JWA, we are a digital archive that helps expand the Jewish narrative by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. And we explore history as a framework for understanding the issues that are important to us today. The Quarantine-ish Book Talks are just one aspect of JWA's very varied work. And I hope you will check out jwa.org to explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. A quick moment of logistics before I introduce our author for tonight. Please introduce yourself in the chat box and ask questions in the chat box, and I will be sure to share them and bring them into our conversation. When you are chatting, please make sure that you're chatting to panelists and attendees so everybody can see the conversation. We love having lively conversation happening in the chat. So welcome, everyone. I am delighted to introduce Carol Isaacs, also known as the cartoonist, the Surreal McCoy. Her cartoons have been published in The New Yorker, The Sunday Times, and many other places. She is also a keyboard player and accordionist in the pop and world music fields, and she's worked with many international artists, including Sinead O'Connor and the Indigo Girls. She's also a founding member of the London Klezmer Quartet. The Wolf of Baghdad, which we'll be discussing tonight, is her first book and is based on her own family's recollections of their lost Iraqi homeland. She's also turned it into an animation, and we'll see some little clips from that, playing Arabic accordion on the soundtrack. And she joins us tonight from London. Welcome, Carol. Thank you so much for being here with us so late your time tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, Judith. Yeah, it's like 1 in the morning. I've had some very good coffee, so I'm ready to go.
Excellent. So let's begin with your story of your family story and how you came to write it in The Wolf of Baghdad.
Yeah, it was like I don't know, people, when you say you're Jewish to people, they think, okay, you're from Eastern Europe, you're from Germany, you're from Russia, you're from Poland. But it was kind of hard to tell people, no, actually there are people, we do come from all around the world, and my family particularly come from the Middle East. So I wanted to put that out there. Apparently there's not much stuff out there, not much history, certainly not a graphic novel that I know of that deals with this subject matter.
What was your process of uncovering the story so that you would have the, the kind of content for writing this story? Did you know those family stories already, or how did you kind of pull it together into this project?
Well, I'll do a little slideshow, shall I?
That sounds great.
Some things. So basically, this comes up. When you're constantly asked where you're from, you start to question it yourself. And I've had that question, as I said, like, where are you from? And then the next question, I tell them I'm from England. And then they say, no, but where are you really from? Because I don't look perhaps like your typical English woman. And so it made me think about, as we talked before, about, roots and homeland. And I lived in 2 worlds, one inside the family home and one out in the outside world. And there's a wonderful word, kauko, it's Finnish, and it means a sense of nostalgia for a place that you've never been to. And that's how I felt about Iraq, because my parents, when they did talk about it, it was with such love and great reminiscences. And it was like this wonderful place that I'd never seen and I've heard about all my life, that I'd never go to. If I may, I'll just give you a quick whistle stop history tour. This is well, what was Mesopotamia, and Jews have lived in Mesopotamia, now Iraq, for over 2,600 years.
I'm not seeing your next slide. I don't know if it hasn't. I'm still seeing the cover.
Are you? Okay, let's try again. I beg your pardon. Yeah. I love it when technology works. Can you see that?
I'm not seeing it.
All right, let me pop out of there and I'll try again. Basically, just to say, can you see that?
Yep, there we go.
We're back. So, in the 1940s, in Iraq, they accounted for 1/3 of Baghdad's population. And within a decade, nearly all 150,000 of Iraq's Jews had fled. And today, fewer than half a dozen remain. So what was a grand, once an amazing community is now dwindled down to maybe 3 or 4 at the last count. And those guys, they're in hiding. They don't really identify as Jewish so much. I'd like to introduce you to my family. So my mother's side, this is the Dangur family pictured in Baghdad in 1910. The gentleman there with the turban is my great-great-great-grandfather on my mother's side. He was Chief Rabbi Ezra Dangur. He was Chief Rabbi of Baghdad. And also I found a photo of him, a portrait of him in the synagogue in Rangoon in Burma. And therein lies a whole other tale. He was chief rabbi there too. And this is my father's family. The Isaacs family are pictured in Baghdad in 1927. Apparently this was the first time they'd seen a camera. Some of the elder generation you can see are wearing Ottoman era style clothing, while the younger are wearing European style clothing. And that's my family tree, albeit a date palm tree. So for the book, I interviewed my family, basically. I went to them and I said, look, I explained what I wanted to do. And I said, I'd like to draw, but also have interspersed between the drawings, your reminiscences, your recollections of life in Iraq, both good and bad. And they were very generous. I interviewed on Skype, I interviewed in person. I came to New York and I interviewed my Aunt Flora before she passed away, thank God. And I got lots of information about their lives, from the mundane to the important. And that kind of informed the arc of the book. So that's that part of the, yeah.
And were they, excited about this project? What was their response? Were they reticent at all to share their stories? Were these stories that you had heard before, or were they mostly new?
They were mostly new. As I said, that it was, not a lot was said about kind of past experience in Baghdad. And I don't know if because, especially my parents, they wanted to move on. They wanted to be British. My dad, above all, wanted to be an English city gent. And he looked the part and he acted the part. And we didn't have music from the Middle East in our house. It was very much European classical music. So there was the only thing we had really was the food. It was very an Iraqi household in that respect. And the food and the language as well. My grandmothers never spoke English, they spoke Judeo-Arabic. So basically I heard the good stuff, I didn't hear the bad part. And through the research for this book, I uncovered a lot of stories that I had no idea had happened to my family. It was quite shocking actually, some of the things that came through, and I had no idea what they had experienced.
It's one of the interesting things that we find in a lot of our oral history work is that people often don't tell you certain things unless you really ask explicitly. There's so many, there's the sort of stories that roll off your tongue and that you're happy to share. And then there are the other ones that you don't share. And often in family, when people are doing family histories, they will hear some story they've never heard from, the grandmother that they saw every week and say, how did you never tell me that? It's like, well, you never asked, right? And when you ask, you can elicit very different kinds of information.
That's why, and I always recommend people asking the elder generation about their lives, because they're going, we're not going to have those stories if they don't tell us them now.
We have a question about Judeo-Arabic and what that is. Can you tell us a little bit about Judeo-Arabic?
Judeo-Arabic is, well, the Iraqi, especially, let's say in Iraq, it's a form of Arabic. It incorporates some Hebrew, some Turkish, some Farsi, Persian, and some Hindi words. And it's spoken amongst the Jewish population. The Jews of Iraq would be fluent in that, but also in the Muslim Arabic, which they would speak in the street if they went shopping or if they had to talk to an official. So they were able to switch between the two depending on circumstance. And it was written, actually, it was written in, when it was written down, it was written in Hebrew script. So you see Hebrew script, but it's actually Arabic. When you speak it, it's Arabic. It's like Yiddish in a way.
Right. And was that something that you learned at all from your family, or was it not really spoken?
Oh yeah, well, my grandmother's never spoke English, so of course I had to know what they were talking about. So I picked it up, and it's still there. And apparently it's very similar to the dialect in the north of Iraq. So whenever I'm with a bunch of Iraqis who are not Jewish and they start speaking, my ears, I can understand some Arabic, but not all. And this language is an endangered language. It's dying out, sadly, because no one is speaking it anymore.
Right. Well, maybe it will have a resurgence the way that Yiddish has had a resurgence in recent years. It takes a couple generations, I think, for people to start to feel nostalgic about roots in that way. But maybe your book will help with that. So we have a question from Rhoda about the title, and that was actually the next piece I was going to ask you about as well, which is, you know, what is the role of the wolf in this book, which is a theme throughout the book.
Am I sharing my screen? Yeah. Can you see that? Oh no, wrong. Where are we? Sorry, we're having some technical issues over here. The role of the wolf. Well, it came from a book I read. Nope. Excuse me. It came from a book I read, written by a chap called David Sassoon. It was a history of the Jews of Baghdad. And in the book, under the chapter Myths and Superstitions, he wrote about the wolf, being like a, sorry, I just want to get my screen share up. Yeah, it's not happening for me. Okay. He wrote about, he said, well, in a Jewish home, often a wolf would be kept in order to keep away demons. And I thought, well, this is like, why not use that motif in the book? And I drew, I found amongst my mother's belongings, in fact, I have it here. I don't know if you can see. It's a little amulet that is actually a wolf's tooth. And this apparently would be pinned to the crib of a child to protect it from evil spirits, because that's what they believed at the time. Whether or not they actually kept a wolf in their cellar is another matter, but apparently it's also a Bedouin myth. I interviewed some Bedouins in Jordan about this very subject, and they said, yes, we but also believe that wearing a wolf's tooth around your neck protects you. Sometimes the women use parts of the wolf in folk medicine to help a woman through labor. So a wolf is very much in the Middle East a symbol of protection, rather than, you know, in the West we have it as a kind of malign, slightly evil influence.
Right. I found that interesting as I was reading the book to see where the wolf kind of appears as almost like a comforting animal, and it doesn't seem menacing in the way that it would in Western folklore.
That's what got me interested in here we go, in sharing in this, and I use the motif throughout the book, and the wolf is kind of protects me as I travel through. There's that little amulet. It's actually, there's several of them in the. There's a great museum in outside of Tel Aviv, Babylonian Heritage Museum. If anyone is ever in Israel, they've got many things about our history there, and it's absolutely fascinating.
But you had never seen that. You found this image, but you had never, I mean, you found the amulet, but you had never seen it. Your mother had never shared it with you, or?
Kind of, we had some amulets, but this particular one I'd never seen before. And it's only until I'd gone to that, the museum, and found it actually, the curator said, yes, look, we have them, come and have a look. And this is what they were for, and put two and two together and found out this more information about the wolf being a sort of mythological protective creature.
And is that a little khamsa at the bottom of it?
A hamsa, that's correct, yeah. It would be, is a little blue turquoise stone in the middle and a hamsa at the bottom.
Nice. So tell us a little bit about the process of bringing the stories from your family into this graphic memoir and then motion comic. What was the process like to transform the stories into this work of art.
Okay, so I'll just screen share again. Hopefully this will work. Can you see that?
Yep.
Grand. So basically, I started drawing pen and pencil, and like with most graphic novels and in a film screenplay, you do what you call a storyboard, which is you just draw it rough, really, really rough. This is the rough idea of how I wanted the beginning pages to look, and this is how it turned out. The beginning of the book starts black and white London, and as you can see, there's a lot of music involved. We'll talk a bit more about that later. I used this wee tool. It's called a graphic tablet with a pen, and you draw on it and you draw directly into your computer. So I was able to use software called Photoshop to sort of color it up and turn it into a book. And this is, I also, as well as drawing the graphic novel, I turned it into an animation, something called a motion comic, which is a form of animation that combines elements of print comic books and animation. And I'm going to show you a sequence from the animation that features that particular page that we just looked at. And as you can see, I'm using the elements to kind of fade in and fade out to give an idea. It's sort of semi-animation, as it were. For the actual research of trying to find out what the early part of last century Baghdad looked like in the Jewish quarter, I found a couple of images online. And because I wanted to draw how my family lived and the houses that they lived in, there wasn't much stuff. But through my blog and through Facebook, I found these amazing guys. There were some students in Baghdad who somehow found me and were asking what I was doing, you know, what's this project that you're doing? And I asked them, I told them that, you know, I'm Jewish, my family from Iraq. They were very intrigued. And I asked them, would you mind going to the old Jewish quarter and taking some photos for me so that I can have some idea of what the houses look like? And they did. And you can see they're kind of run down, very decrepit. This is the typical Jewish house that the women would sit in these balconies behind these wooden shutters, and they'd peer down to the alleyways below and they'd be able to see what was going on, sort of hidden away. And the idea of how this is how I drew it, in fact, essentially, there's no paper involved here at all. It's all on my tab, on my computer. You can see the working space and the different pages.
That's amazing.
This was a quote I remember from one of my family. She said, even if we could go back to Iraq, it would be as Jewish ghosts. And when I was doing the research and development part of this project, I had a most wonderful mentor called Hilary Price, local girl for you. She lives in Massachusetts.
Yeah, rhymes with orange, right?
Exactly, yeah. Shout out to Hilary. She mentored me through the first 3 months of doing the research and development. In fact, I was given some money by the English Arts Council and also Dungor Education to fund this part of it, for which I'm very grateful. So we talked about how to show people, and it was the idea of showing them as ghosts. This is my grandmother. They're kind of slightly see-through. And this is how they appear throughout the book. And there's my uncle and my auntie there. And this is me finding my grandfather, who I never met, in his study in the old house in the Jewish quarter. And throughout the book, I appear in this kind of cloak. I can see the characters, but they can't see me. So that's how I time travel through this book.
So did you know, I have many questions about all of this. Did you know that you were, from the beginning, did you envision yourself in the story? Like, did you know that you were going to put yourself into the story as a character? And why, you know, I found it interesting that the people who lived there appear as ghosts, and you who has never been there you're not a ghost. How did you decide to make yourself a solid being?
It just seemed the most logical thing. I don't know. It's kind of inversion, isn't it, really? But it's just the idea that they're not there anymore. It's very much that homeland that's gone, and there's just the ghosts of them still remain, perhaps wandering through those narrow alleyways. And I'm just being myself, trying to sort of follow them through and search. And this is one of the memories that my mother told me actually. She remembers her mother, my grandmother, always wearing the abaya when she went to the market. The abaya was that black cloak. And essentially I'll show you this is one of the pages from the book, a double page. Essentially, when women stepped outside of the house, they would wear the abaya, this cloak that would render them kind of invisible. So I was invisible going through the book in that way as well. But they would blend in with everybody else. They wouldn't sort of stick out. The fact that they spoke, they could also speak the Muslim dialect meant that they wouldn't be singled out as Jews, because at some point it was not good to be seen as a Jew in Iraq. So this is
the original cloak of invisibility.
Exactly, correct, yeah. And this is my grandmother going through the Shuk and into the Al Shorja market, and most of the merchants there would have been Jewish. So just to give you an idea of how that looked. There's another memory from my uncle Nassim. He remembers that we moved from the old Jewish quarter of Baghdad into a more modern European house by the river. And in this page, I show their lives, the golden times. They went to the sports club, they went swimming, boating on the Tigris, they had picnics in the desert, they went dancing in nightclubs. They led a golden, charmed life, my family. Well, the Jews, the middle-class Jews of Iraq. And there's a lovely photo that I found of them in the garden. That's my grandmother with her children. And there's me at the gate at the back, if you can see. This photo really, it broke my heart, because that was kind of, I call it kind of peak happiness, peak serenity, because after that photo was taken, everybody left. And beyond the gate, hell was breaking loose. My father remembers this. He said what followed was a terrible shock to the Jewish population. And what he's referring to is the Farhud, which happened in 1941. It was, Farhud is an Arabic word for pogrom. It was really the culmination of several things. The Nazi ideology had begun to take hold in the 1930s in Iraq, and politicians were adopting a lot of those. In fact, the Iraqi school model of 1939 was adopted, the Nazi school model was adopted by the Iraqi public school system. In this page, panel by panel, I'm showing the terrible things that happened, the hangings, the bombings, the assassinations, the intimidation. And really kind of that was, 1941 was kind of the scales dropping from their eyes. And the Jews of Iraq realizing perhaps they didn't belong in their homeland anymore. And 1948, when the state of Israel was born and wars were declared, that was kind of the nail in the coffin, as it were. And 1950, 51, about 120,000 Jews left Iraq out of 150. Most went to Israel, were airlifted out there. A lot of my family went there. Some came to the UK, some went to America. But essentially, Jewish life, as it had been known for 2,600 years, was gone.
And that's one of the things that I think is very striking in the book, is that, you know, the first part of the book is very much about that sort of golden age and that period of harmony. And you see how, you know, rich and natural their lives, your family's life is there. And then there's this shift into a story that is, you know, about the persecution and destruction of the community. So, you know, as you were thinking about telling this story, did it feel hard to, I mean, was it clear always that you were going to tell that whole arc? And did you have, you know, sort of, what was your process in figuring out how much of which piece to emphasize, or how you wanted to display that?
Well, I didn't want to sugarcoat anything. And there are some kind of graphic scenes in the book that refer to hangings and, you know, the terrible killings that went on. It's like, it's kind of a personal family statement. It's just a record of facts, really. That's all I'm doing, is presenting them, trying to present them in a way that, in context, as it were. Not many people know that in 1930s, Iraq was very heavily influenced, as I said, by the Nazi ideology, so much so that, you know, there was a chap called Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amini al-Husseini, who went to, in early 1930s, was pictured with Hitler having tea. There were very cordial relations. In fact, they had many big plans. They thought that if Hitler could win over Europe, that he could get into Iraq and the Middle East and cleanse the Middle East, especially Iraq, of its Jews. There were plans afoot for concentration camps within Iraq itself. Not many people know that. And this toxic mix of Nazi ideology and Iraqi nationalism actually built up into that final event, the pogrom in 1941, where over 2 days, rioting mobs went mad in Baghdad. They killed hundreds, we don't know how many to this day, died. And many businesses were wiped out, women were raped, babies were killed. It was awful. And it was a real turning point, as I said before. So I wanted to show that and show that, you know, this is what happened to us. This is why we left. And we left quietly. They always said that this was the silent exile. I left quietly and without fuss and moved into the terrible conditions in the in desert in Israel, and the Ma'abarot, the tented villages that they lived in for years. So my family went and lived in a little tent until they could be housed in Tel Aviv. They gave everything up. They left everything behind. This has to be acknowledged somehow.
Right, absolutely. And it is such a shocking figure to go from, you know, this very large community to pretty much nobody almost overnight. And in some ways, even though the story of persecution is very familiar to other communities in you know, other global Jewish communities, the speed with which the community disappeared seems very striking. You know, when you think about how many Jews in Europe resisted leaving after pogroms, and you think, and sometimes they couldn't, but when you think about the, you know, the fact that the Iraqi Jewish community had been there for thousands of years, and how quickly they pulled up stakes, it's really quite shocking, and must have been very strange also for their neighbors, for Jews to suddenly not be a presence in society anymore.
Yes, we hear lots of stories. I mean, my family continued. My father still had business associates and friends in non-Jewish in Iraq, and they would come to visit us. We would be in touch with them, and we knew they were mourning our leaving as well. And actually, there's I don't know if it's because of the Arab Spring a few years ago, but there's a new interest now in Iraq, especially into what happened to the Jews. And through this project, I have to tell you, something really unexpected has come out of this, that there's been this reaching out from the Iraqis to us to find, where were you? What happened to you? Where's your history? There's a lot of interest in Jewish history now in Iraq, and so much so, books are being published there that are written by Iraqi Jews now living in Israel, that are being translated from Hebrew into Arabic. And last year were on sale at the Baghdad International Book Fair. So there is interest. There's interest in my book to be published in Arabic. I've been invited to visit, to present, and to. Wonderful. They're fascinated. They want to know more, which is really heartening. And especially the Iraqi diaspora here in the UK has been so welcoming to me, and they've reached out, and I've made some wonderful friends through this project. So it's amazing. It's something I never would have dreamed could have happened.
Right. It's such an interesting sort of unexpected outcome that, you know, you wrote this story to explore your own family story, but actually found that it connected you with many people beyond the Iraqi Jewish community.
Exactly. And they're coming to me and they're saying, well, we recognize what you're telling us. We know these stories. We know the drawings that we recognize these places. We understand sleeping on the roof. We understand, and especially music. As I said before, music is really important as a musician. I was not brought up with the music from Iraq, and only the last few years have I started to learn. And it's just joyful. It's like a whole other language that I never knew about. And it speaks to so many people. We perform this as an animation. We perform it like a silent movie. I have a band and we play as the images are on the screen, and we play music from Iraq. We play music of Judeo-Arabic origin. we play music of Iraqi folk origin and also Iraqi classical songs. And a lot of the classical songs were written by Iraqi Jews at the time. That Saleh al-Kuwaiti was a very famous writer in the 1920s and 30s. His name has since been erased from the history books. I think Saddam Hussein took it upon himself to erase all memory, saying that these songs, still popular today, by the way, were written by, or were traditional, right? So again, there's that research of interest that people who know that they were written by Jews, and the music that what we play connects to people. In one, when we did the premiere of the animation here in the UK in London, it was over 2 nights. The first night I invited the Israeli embassy to come. The second night I invited the Iraqi embassy to come, and they sat in the front row and they were singing and crying along. And they said to me at the end, we know this music. This is our music too. There was so much that we had in common. It was a very powerful moment, really.
Right. Well, especially I would imagine in diaspora communities, in the end, being an immigrant is a shared experience, you know, and the nostalgia or the homesickness for the place that you described at the beginning is a shared experience, more so than any differences that might have been the case there.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about the music, because that was one of the things that I was really struck by when I first opened the book, is that it opens, you know, it's on the one hand a silent book, right? It's wordless for the most part. And I'm interested in hearing how you chose that, you know, to kind of frame it the way you did with the stories or little pieces and quotes from family members, but otherwise no narration. But you do have this, you know, it begins with, you're brought into the story through music, because there are the notes that are kind of floating through London, and that kind of bring you out of your own life and back into your family's history. So how did you think about, you know, did you always know, I mean, you're a musician, so maybe that makes sense, but did you always know that you were going to start with music as the kind of lure?
Kind of, because the book starts with me listening to that music, Iraqi, the Al-Kuwaiti brothers, an old, scratchy old recording, and being transported from there through my family's memories back to Baghdad. And in Baghdad, music was important to them as well. We were very religious. The Iraqi Jewish community, we didn't have the different strains that we have here in the West. It was very much Orthodox. Everybody went to synagogue, everybody followed the festivals. It was very much part of their lives, ingrained in their lives. And music was a huge part of that. You go to and you'd sing the hymns, you'd sing the prayers. The music was of the Middle East. In fact, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Arabic music. It's something called maqam, which is maqamat, scales, very different to European scales. If you've ever heard it, it sounds like things are slightly out of tune, but actually there are more notes in the scale than in the Western scale. It's very, very rich music. And it was the music of the Middle East, and the Jews of Iraq, that's what they listened to, that's what they sang in the synagogues. If you walk past a synagogue in Baghdad, you could be forgiven for thinking that it was a mosque, because the sounds coming from that would sound Arabic. And they were. There was a wonderful story that was told to me that in those days, on the Thursday night in a cafe in Baghdad, an imam and a cantor, sounds like a beginning of a joke, would gather, and they would talk about what maqamat, what scales they would be using in their respective services over the next couple of days, so that they could make it all sound great, like over the whole of Baghdad, like the noise, the sounds coming from the mosques and the synagogues would be in tune with each other. I just thought music is so important, and not just the religious music, but also the secular music, the music of the coffee houses, of the nightclubs, would be mostly Jewish. In fact, the Iraqi National Radio Orchestra who broadcast every night, were comprised entirely of Jewish musicians except for one. And there was a story that on Yom Kippur there was no broadcast, and the Prime Minister at the time was saying, well, what's happened? Why is there no music? And he had to be told why, that Jews don't play on these occasions. So music is really the heart and soul of the book as well, in that respect.
Right. And I love that image of the mosque and the synagogue harmonizing. I mean, if you need a literal depiction of the harmonious relations in that period, that there it is.
Yeah, there it is, exactly. And it's still a tradition continued to this day. I know there's some Iraqi synagogues here in London that my collaborator, Daniel Jonas, and who worked on the soundtrack for the animation, he brought in the traditions from there, the piyutim that we use, the religious prayers that we use, religious music that we use in the animation was very important because that also tells the story of where you are in the story arc.
Mm-hmm. Can you play a little bit of that
Sure.
For us?
Let me just pull up my. I don't know where you are. Oh, have you got the screen? Yeah, you've got the screen. Yeah. Okay, let me just come out of there. Let me play you a bit from. This is, I'll tell you, this is a piyut called Yadcha Tanheni. It's a sequence from the animation, and it's a piyut, the text by Yisrael Najara, and it's "May your hand guide me." That's the English translation. It's 16th century, written in the 16th century. The melody is Babylonian Jewish, and you can hear my collaborator Daniel along with a kanun accompaniment, and it's accompanies the part of the story where I'm exploring the house in Baghdad. So you get the idea. It's all, the music is chosen to be relevant to what's going on the screen.
You didn't grow up with that kind of music in your household. So how did you discover it? What was the process like for you of the musical exploration?
A few years ago, it came, gosh, about 10 years ago, I formed with some other musicians, formed a klezmer band. Talk of cultural appropriation. And I first went to klezmer because I thought, oh, this sounds Middle Eastern vaguely. I don't know why I like the sound of it. But anyway, one of the musicians got a gig with this Iraqi oud player. And she said, why don't you come along, come and learn. He's really cool. You might like an oud is like is an Arabic guitar. It's a lute, Arabic lute. And I learned from him. I went and I joined the Baghdad ensemble for a little while, and I played with him, and he taught me my own culture. He taught me my own heritage. So I kind of came to it from Northern European music, as it were. But then for this project, I got in touch with this chap, Daniel Jonas, and Keith Clouston, who's a highly experienced, an English oud player who's studied in Algeria and knows this music thoroughly. And they helped me with putting together the soundtrack and choosing the pieces that we'd use.
So, you've said that obviously your family wasn't raising you steeped in these particular traditions, and that they were eager to be British. So tell us a little bit about what it was like to grow up with Iraqi parents in London, and what that immigrant experience was like for you.
Well, shall I do a little reading from the book?
Sure.
Let me just get this share up again. So I'm going to do a little reading from the book, and it's from the afterword of the book, Wolf of Baghdad. And I have to thank really my fantastic editor at Myriad Editions, Corinne Pullman, who suggested that I add some more information to the back of the book just to give some context. And she picked especially a short story, like a really short graphic thing that I'd done for a feminist comics anthology called Strumpet.
It's a great name.
Yeah. And it was about 4 years ago, and they were putting out a call for short stories on the theme of origin stories. So I wrote a little story about my origin, like my background, and this kind of kicked off actually the idea for the book. So I'll just read you the first couple of pages. Okay, so Deep Home, right. I'm a musician and cartoonist, a first generation elder daughter, born in the UK to Iraqi Jewish parents. Although we lived in a quiet and genteel suburb of London, I lived in two worlds, the England in which I was born and the lost world of my Iraqi family's roots. Our suburban house, normally a cold and self-contained unit, would come alive one Sunday each month during my childhood, when business associates of my father would visit us for afternoon tea. My father commuted to the city every day, where he ran an import-export business. Dapper in his pinstripe suit and bowler hat, he would often cut a rose from our front garden for his buttonhole, quite the English city gent, although I never did find out what it was that he imported and exported. The last of our family had fled Iraq by the mid-1960s, and to all intents and purposes regarded itself as British, settling quietly and without fuss into suburban London. Our Sunday visitors to the house were mainly my father's non-Jewish business associates and their families from Iraq. They arrived Magi-like from the East, bearing gifts of Iraqi gold necklaces, bracelets, and other trinkets. They came to see my father, not only for business, but also for health reasons. He would arrange their hospital and doctor's appointments, as medical care in Iraq was hard to come by, unless, of course, you had contacts. Being part of the Christian or Jewish minority meant you were already at a disadvantage. And in turn, my mother would provide the wives and daughters with undergarments from Marks and Spencer's, sturdy and no-nonsense affairs. We later found out, though, that they cut the labels out before returning to Iraq, so as not to be seen to be frequenting Jewish-owned businesses. My mother would painstakingly prepare the Sunday tea at least 1 week beforehand. The traditional Middle Eastern delicacies were all meticulously made by hand, taught by her own mother. Baklava, layers of thin pastry filled with chopped nuts and sweetened with syrup. Sambusak, half-moon pastries with a cheese filling. But, little round cookies stuffed with dates and sprinkled with sesame seeds. She would also add what she thought to be a traditional English touch, small rolls filled with cream cheese, egg and cress, or smoked salmon with little twists of lemon. This feast was wheeled out on her pride and joy, the gold and black hostess trolley. A silver tea set, a wedding gift, would be polished and buffed the day before and sat on the top along with the silver teaspoons and miniature cake forks. Her best china plates, a neatly folded paper napkin carefully placed in between each one, were stacked underneath. But that's just an idea of growing up, my childhood in London. One house, one world inside the house and one world outside the house.
And what was it like in the British Jewish community as an Iraqi Jew?
We are very small. We're a minority within a minority anyway. If I can tell you that, I think there's about almost 3 million Jews in the UK today. And of those, 10,000 of us are from Iraqi origins, either from Iraq itself or via India. In my school, there were 900 girls, 30 of them were Jewish, and I was the only Jew from Mizrahi background, from Middle Eastern background. So we were always kind of the minority within the minority, the other within the other.
And did your family have other friends who were immigrants from Iraq, Jewish immigrants from Iraq?
Yes, there was a small community in London, also in Manchester and outside of London too, but there were a few synagogues in London. And as of course, with like any Jewish community, there'd be one synagogue you go to and one synagogue you ignore, right?
Right, of course. Yeah. No matter how small the community is, somehow we manage to find a
delightful tradition that we continue to uphold. Yes.
Right, exactly. So I'm thinking about also what it was like to grow up as a girl in an Iraqi Jewish family and community. I'm thinking both for you and also the stories that you heard from family members as you were interviewing them. Um, were there, how traditional were gender norms, and did you feel that even in your assimilated family?
Well, if you go back a couple of generations, I mean, girls were being married off at, I think, 9 or 11 or 13. I know that both my grandmothers were very, very young when they married, and they often married older men. That was a norm. And in fact, my mother did the same. She married a man, my father, who was almost 60 when he had us, a generation above her. So in our household, we had actually two generations. So my father was from a much older generation. But they were very forward thinking. My mother's generation went to European style school. The Alliance Israélite Française set up schools in Baghdad beginning of the last century and taught. The curriculum was French. It was very European. It was very much girls went to school. They had a girls' school as well as a boys' school. So education was very important for both sexes. As I said, probably being a woman in Baghdad in the last century was not the best thing to be, but coming to the UK, they adopted the norms here and I was given full freedom. Although I'm sure they would have loved me to be a lawyer or a doctor. I wasn't to be. I ran away to join the rock and roll circus when I was 16. My poor parents, I feel so sorry for them, but I only wish they could see the book, that, see what's happening now, it's kind of come big circle. I've come back to my roots and it's quite amazing. But yeah, they were very much, I had a really good education within the system here. We had the freedom that I had, the freedom my mother never had. She couldn't follow her dreams. She was a wonderful singer. Actually, she had the most amazing voice, but her father, she always told me that it was very much frowned upon that nice girls didn't go into that kind of a profession. So she became a teacher and a seamstress herself.
And was she excited that you had inherited the musical talent, or she was?
I think, well, from the age of 4, I was playing piano, so it was kind of a no-brainer that that's what I'd be when I grow up. Right. It was a given, and I think they were very supportive. I mean, they gave me music lessons and even came to some of my gigs when they realized that I was serious and this was a proper career that I had set my heart on. Yeah.
To go back to some of the larger history, I know that you talked about how the Iraqi Jewish community had been there for, more than 2,000 years. Do you know if your family had been there for many, many, many generations, or whether they came from other places in the Middle East?
It's possible. We don't know for sure. I guess maybe taking a DNA test might answer some of those questions. We don't really have a family tree as such. It was more oral history. Mm-hmm. We have something that goes back to the 1880s or the 1870s. I know that on my mother's side, as I said, we've got a couple of chief rabbis of Baghdad. I think on my father's side, my grandmother, on his mother had blue eyes, and there was talk of maybe some Russian or coming through Syria and coming down that way, and maybe there's some Russian blood in us. I don't know. But our culture, our heritage has always been assumed to be this, 2,600 years worth.
And we have a question from Chava about what was the relationship between the Iraqi Jewish community and the Iraqi nationalists?
It depends on which era we're talking about. Are we talking about the 50s, the 60s? I know that if we're talking on a more basic level, in neighborhoods, people got on. In fact, during that terrible pogrom I told you about, I have many witness statements from my family to say that their neighbors, their non-Jewish, their Muslim neighbors protected them. One woman stood at the end of the street and said to the rioters, "You will not pass, these are my neighbors." Someone else stood with a gun and said, "No, you're not coming through here. These are our cousins, our family." So I know that the Jewish position has not always been great throughout the years. If you look at we always had what was called dhimmi status, which means it's like a second-class citizen, that you would have to pay special taxes. There were certain rules that you had to follow. You couldn't build your house higher than a Muslim's house. You couldn't ride a horse, because that would mean you were higher than a Muslim. You would have to wear a certain color hat, and you'd pay taxes. And this kind of continued throughout the years. The Jews kind of fortunes waxed and waned. I think through the Ottoman Empire, it was fairly okay. When the British came, 1917, suddenly their fortunes turned and became really good. And there were Jews in the Iraqi parliament in 1917 when the British were there. So it depends on the era and which generation you ask. If you ask the younger of my mother's siblings, they would say it was terrible. We don't ever want to go back. My father's generation would say it was great. I had non-Jewish business associates and friends. So I kind of depends on the era.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that you had family that went to Israel and to the States, and I imagine that their experiences were quite different depending on where they ended up.
Yes, in Israel, it wasn't a very happy beginning. I think a sudden influx of so many Jews from Arab lands. It wasn't just Iraq, it was from all over the Arab world coming into Israel, into an already like a struggling state with the problems they had with the European refugees that they already had there. Must have been a huge shock. I mean, an amazing achievement that they managed to get to airlift so many in from everywhere. But it was very much the Jews from Mizrahi Jews were regarded for a long time as the enemy, because they spoke Arabic. Their culture was Arabic. They didn't fit in with the European ideal of a Zionist state of Israel.
Right.
Ironic, considering that they'd come from, they were indigenous to that area anyway. And I think to this day, it's still not, they're still not on a par. You don't get many Mizrahi academics, I could be wrong, but and especially in power as well. But for a long time, they were very much considered quite inferior. Ironically, through music, suddenly Mizrahi music is very popular in Israel. And there's one artist who, if you're interested in this, a guy called Dudu Tassa, who is the grandson of Salah al-Kuwaiti, this Jewish Iraqi composer. He's doing the most amazing work. He started off life as a rock star in Israel, and he, like me, found his family's heritage and decided to bring his grandfather's song into more modern spotlight. And he's done some amazing albums. And there's a great story that this Iraqi woman told me, that she'd visited Baghdad a couple of years ago, and in the city downtown, some young guy was blasting through his stereo speakers in his car a Dudu Tassa album. Like an Israeli playing Iraqi Jewish music blasting through Baghdad. I mean, how perfect is that?
Right. It is very interesting. I mean, and I think just to it's the places where as you mentioned earlier, where the cultures are the same, and if you can let go of the all the political things we bring to it, then those natural connections shine through. But in terms of what you were saying about Israel, it's a piece of Israeli history that Israel is really only just now beginning to grapple with and kind of come to terms with, I think.
Yes, in fact, it's only the last 5 years that the Knesset has actually recognized, thanks to an organization called Harif, who a charity here in the UK representing the Jews from Arab lands and Iran. They lobbied for a special day to be commemorated. I think it's the 31st of November every year, to be commemorated around the world, to commemorate the exodus of Jewish refugees from Arab lands and Iran. Just so that that's acknowledged, at least. I mean, I know there are moves for reparation of some kind. People want, there is an organization that's kind of collecting names, because we left with nothing. My parents' families left everything behind, businesses, houses, everything. I mean, the material stuff. So they often turned up in whatever country they were with nothing at all and started from scratch. Right. Albeit thankful that they were safe and secure. What had happened to them was not on the scale of what had happened to the European Jews, which is why our families are big and are widespread. I mean, my family is all over the world, in North America, in Israel, in Australia as well.
And when you kind of rediscovered and amplified this story of your family, did that bring others in your family to reconnect with their Iraqi roots? Like, did you sort of start a revival within your own family?
Kind of, and also like this really cool. Suddenly, I'm finding more family. My wonderful cousin by marriage, Stella, who lives in New York. I think she's watching today. I found her through one of these meetings. It's like, whenever I go to Australia, I'm finding more and more relatives there. I tour a lot in Australia, and a lot of the Jews who from Iraq went to Burma, and from Burma went to Australia. And so I'm finding it's incredible how we've ended up. And also children of my cousins who are now of an age, teenagers now, who are kind of interested in family history. They're being presented with this book and say, look, this is us, read it, you know. So you can but hope that they'll be interested and it will continue.
Yes. And we had a couple questions about, you know, what age do you think would you recommend this book for? So a lot of people are interested in the book. If they're going to buy it for people, do you think it could work for a middle school audience? Obviously for adults, but in terms of, you know, how would you conceive of the right age range for this book?
I think it's with the motion comic is labeled PG, which is parental guidance. So I would suggest parental guidance. It's funny you should mention middle grade. There are moves maybe to publish a version. I can't say anymore because we're in talks, a middle grade version of this book, because literally there is nothing about our history, really, hardly anything. So watch this space, as they say. But yeah, I mean, read it with your parents. If the parents want to get it, I believe it's available. We don't have an American publisher yet, but it's available at Barnes and Noble for a very good price with free shipping. If you don't want to patronize the internet giant who shall remain nameless. But you can also watch the video on demand. It's on my website. I think you'll put details in the chat. The motion comic, the animation, has a music soundtrack, and you can buy a DVD or rent a video to live stream or whatever. It's all there. It's all on my website. Yeah. So.
And what else as a last question, what can we look forward to coming from you? What are you working on now that we can keep our eyes open for?
Well, we talked about the Iraqi Jews. They went far and wide. Some of them left to India, and there was a big population of Jews originally from Iraq and India. Some went to Burma, and that's where some of my father's family ended up in the late 1800s. And I went before lockdown. Timing was impeccable. I went to Burma to do some research for a book proposal about my family there, about a musician who, on my father's side, and I took my own instrument, and I'm hoping it will be a book at some point, but that's the next project.
That sounds amazing. Well, we look forward to keeping our eyes open for that. And I'm going to actually also put in the chat, we have some resources on our site, but when you said the Iraqi community in India, we have an article on that, which I just put in the chat. There is so much to learn from this beautiful, beautiful book. For those of you who haven't seen it yet, I hope your appetite was whet by these, being able to see the images and hear some of Carol's stories and the music. And Carol, I want to thank you so much for sharing your family's story with us, and for sharing so much of your work and your process. And thanks to all of you who are with us tonight for your excellent questions and comments. And I really feel like this is not only an important and not well enough known part of Jewish history, but it also, as we discuss, is so resonant with so many people's experiences as immigrants and refugees around the world today. So thank you so much, Carol, for illuminating it for us. And as you said, people will be able to get your book, even though you don't yet have a US publisher. It's available through Barnes & Noble, and we've put some, in the chat, we've put some links to your website where people can also see the animation and music, and we encourage you to seek it out. I hope that everyone will also join us next week. Next week's program is a little bit of a aberration from our usual schedule. It's on Wednesday night and it's at a later time, which I realize isn't great for the Eastern folks, people in the Eastern time zone. We'll be meeting at 9:30 Eastern time because we're partnering with a program in Seattle. We will be I'll be in conversation with Professor Jonathan Sarna on the rediscovered 19th century Jewish woman novelist Cora Wilburn. You have to register separately with the Seattle JCC, which you can find that link on our site because they're sponsoring that program. But then the next 2 Thursday nights, we will have our regular Thursday night programming on February 4th and 11th. February 4th with Talia Lavin on the very timely topic of right-wing online culture. And then a fun program on February 11th with Jody Eichler-Levine on Judaism and crafting with a special add-on optional crafting project. So I hope to see you all then. And in the meantime, I encourage you to check out the many, many resources we have in our digital archive at jwa.org, including some articles and information about Iraqi Jews, but also material from our online exhibits and encyclopedia and podcast and blog. There's so much material to discover and to help you gain insight into the diversity of the Jewish story. So thank you again to Carol. Thank you all for joining us. And until next time, be well and have a lovely evening. Wonderful.